Now that we've determined which games and which settings are the best examples of ray tracing, we can continue looking at the real-world ray tracing experience on existing products. Today we'll be revisiting ray tracing on the cheapest GPU from the initial NVIDIA RTX launch, the card that NVIDIA promised would deliver ray tracing into the hands of mid-range gamers, the GeForce RTX 2060. How well has this card stood the test of time, and did NVIDIA actually sell you something useful in this GPU's ray tracing capabilities? Well, it's time to find out. This is all part of our goal to try and understand ray tracing better in the lead up to a new graphics card generation, which is expected to begin in early 2025. What are the best games to test? How many games are delivering a worthwhile ray tracing experience? How important is this feature as part of a GPU package? And crucially for this revisit of the RTX 2060, what have gamers been sold up to this point, and what is the baseline to benchmark improvements against, especially in the mainstream market? Looking at the RTX 2060 is quite a contrast to our previous video exploring NVIDIA and AMD's high-end GPUs and what the best experiences look like today. When the RTX 2060 launched in early 2019, it was a mid-range GPU priced at $350 US and the lowest model in the new RTX product stack that supported ray tracing. A direct replacement for the GTX 1070 based on price, the key feature that NVIDIA were pushing with the 2060 was ray tracing. Get this card instead of a GeForce 10 series GPU because it supports RTX features including ray tracing and DLSS. Now at the time, DLSS was a colossal flop, but over time that has developed into a worthwhile feature inclusion, so gamers that bought a 2060 for DLSS have seen that experience get better and better. Can the same be said for ray tracing more than 5 years after the card debuted? It's important here to first set the stage for what the RTX 2060 was when it came out. As a mid-range graphics card, it was positioned for 1440p 60fps gaming using ultra settings, and that's certainly what we found in our initial review. We tested a bunch of games at 1440p and found the 2060 was a decently capable 1440p GPU, with most games playable at 60fps. Steve called it the best value mid-range GPU available at the time, but was also disappointed with the bang for buck on offer, as it didn't offer that much better cost per frame than the GTX 1070, despite being an entirely new generation, and it didn't move the mid-range forward by all that much. Given that the card was just 10 to 15% faster than the GTX 1070 at launch, our opinion at the time was that NVIDIA were attempting two things. One, to sell gamers on RTX features like ray tracing and DLSS instead of raw performance improvements, and two, to increase GPU prices in general and raise up the mid-range in response to gamers buying up expensive graphics cards. The 2060 wasn't quite as egregious as models like the RTX 2070 and RTX 2080, but NVIDIA was certainly still attempting to sell gamers on future promises rather than current capabilities. And now the future is here, so it's time to look at how the RTX 2060 aged and whether those promises came true. Now, when I first thought about this revisit, my goal was to examine the 2060 at the resolution it was designed for at launch, 1440p. But after a little bit of testing, it's pretty clear that the RTX 2060 has not aged well for 1440p gaming, even without ray tracing enabled. With just 6GB of VRAM, there are many modern titles that run into VRAM related issues at 1440p, and nearly 6 years after launch, it's just not offering mid-range performance anymore, which is as expected. These days, the 2060 is more like an entry-level 1080p GPU. It's generally a little slower than the Radeon RX 6600, and I suspect people that bought a 2060 for 1440p gaming have since upgraded to a newer card such as the RTX 4060. So this revisit is now focusing on 1080p and whether the RTX 2060 can run decent quality ray tracing effects at all, and you'll see why this makes sense in the performance charts. I'm focusing on games where we found ray tracing is worth using, plus a couple of new additions including titles that only use ray tracing like Star Wars Outlaws, so let's get into it. I'm going to start here with Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart at 1080p max settings with DLSS quality enabled, a pretty standard configuration that someone might be using to play games at 1080p. This game is a real struggle for the RTX 2060 even without ray tracing enabled, as it achieves just 43 FPS on average. Turning on ray tracing is just something you wouldn't consider doing, as it lowers the frame rate below 30 FPS on average, even on lower quality settings. But something we often hear when talking about ray tracing is this idea that mid-range gamers could theoretically use ray tracing with lower overall quality presets. So instead of running the ultra preset plus ray tracing, you'd use medium or low plus ray tracing. Now, I'm not advocating for this as a sensible configuration, as the overall visual quality from low plus ray tracing is usually worse than running ultra without ray tracing. But when we're seeing ray tracing configurations run below 30 FPS at 1080p with upscaling enabled, I guess we should ask the question of whether there's any configuration at all where ray tracing is usable. And so for Ratchet & Clank, along with all other games, I've tried to lower settings until ray tracing is potentially usable to see what we're working with. In other words, how compromised the experience gets to use ray tracing on an RTX 2060. With Ratchet & Clank, it's really not possible to use ray tracing at all on the 2060. Even using very low settings and upscaling, enabling ray tracing causes a 40% performance hit, and this takes a modest 80 FPS output, which isn't that great for very low settings, and takes performance to just 48 FPS on average. And if you want the highest quality effects that minimize visual artifacts, it's a 44 FPS experience. In contrast to this, Guardians of the Galaxy is playable with ray tracing enabled on the 2060. Rasterized performance using max settings and DLSS upscaling is over 100 FPS in the area we tested, so enabling RT reflections drops performance, but still maintains a frame rate above 60 FPS. Granted, we are testing at 1080p, but this is a win for the 2060 as we don't have to lower quality settings to find a configuration where ray tracing is usable. Doom Eternal runs really well on the RTX 2060 without ray tracing enabled, achieving 150 FPS on average using Ultra Nightmare settings at native 1080p. But when enabling ray tracing, the card is crippled to just 42 FPS on average, which is unplayable in this sort of fast-paced shooter. The good news though is that you don't have to compromise on settings too much to get ray tracing into a semi-usable position. Dropping to the Ultra preset and enabling DLSS delivers 72 FPS on average with ray tracing enabled. This isn't the way I would choose to play. I'd rather get 174 FPS without ray tracing enabled, but the card can technically run RT in this game if you want to. The RTX 2060 struggles to run ray tracing in Suicide Squad. 1080p high settings using DLSS quality, the game does run into stuttering issues, especially with ray tracing enabled, which cripples performance, and I believe this is largely due to insufficient VRAM. The game is playable with ray tracing enabled if you're willing to drop the preset to low, but even still this results in just 73 FPS on average, which is hardly amazing given the reductions to visual quality outside of reflections. Dragon Age the Veilguard is a new entrant into our ray tracing testing, with the game improving visuals in some areas primarily through ray traced reflections. However, the RTX 2060 is not good enough in general to run the game using ultra settings, even at 1080p using DLSS quality. High VRAM requirements just slaughter the 6GB buffer on this GPU. To get ray tracing into even a semi-usable position, you have to drop the overall preset to low and largely stick to selective ray tracing, which is quite limited in where it applies the effect. You can forget about ray tracing in Ghostwire Tokyo using max settings, as there's quite a bit of stuttering and performance issues after a few minutes of gameplay when ray tracing is enabled. Again, this seems to be a VRAM issue, 6GB just isn't enough. To get high quality RT into a usable position, I had to lower the overall preset down to low, and even then there was still performance issues despite a 60 FPS average, lots of stuttering and just an unpleasant experience. Theoretically, you could use low settings plus low ray tracing, but the quality of low RT reflections in this title is largely not worth using. Watch Dogs Legion is one of the older titles tested, and the RTX 2060 can deliver a playable frame rate using 1080p max settings and DLSS, though it falls short of 60 FPS. Enabling ray tracing in this configuration is basically out of the question unless you like 30 FPS gaming. To achieve 60 FPS with ray tracing enabled, you have to drop most other quality settings down to low, leading to significant visual compromises just to enable RT. The Witcher 3 is another game where the RTX 2060 struggles to deliver a playable experience with ray tracing enabled, even at 1080p. Ultra Plus settings is completely out of the question, as the GPU even struggles to hit 60 FPS using that preset without ray tracing, but what surprised me is how taxing RT was on the low preset. When you can get over 100 FPS in this title using these settings, enabling RT global illumination on the lowest possible setting only straight up halved performance and takes the RTX 2060 below 60 FPS on average. Maxing out RT and we're back to just a 30 FPS experience, so it's difficult to justify using RT in this title on the 2060. Control launched with ray tracing just a few months after the RTX 2060 and isn't really playable on max settings due to texture loading issues, despite reasonable frame rates. To resolve this, I had to enable DLSS quality and drop the preset to medium, but after doing this, the RTX 2060 can run ray tracing in this title at reasonable frame rates. Yes, it's a compromised experience in terms of visual quality, but I'll take it as a win. The 2060 is more than powerful enough to run Dying Light 2 using ultra settings without ray tracing enabled, hitting 91 FPS on average with DLSS quality enabled. But if you want to use ray tracing in this title, at least on settings that actually improve visual quality noticeably, it's difficult to achieve consistent 60 FPS. The game is playable at around 50 FPS using max settings, but lowering the visual preset couldn't quite push that average up to 60 FPS, and whether or not frame rates in the 50s are good enough is questionable. Spider-Man Miles Morales is borderline playable with ray tracing enabled, achieving 50 FPS on average using max settings, although 1% lows aren't great. Like with Dying Light 2, lowering the overall preset all the way down to low still can't push ray tracing up to 60 FPS on average at 1080p, which is disappointing. With that said, as you can see from the Spider-Man results, you could probably tweak settings slightly to get ray tracing into a usable and playable configuration, given that reflections on high can deliver 60 FPS on average with a decent experience on lower settings. But as we've found through most of this exploration so far, ray tracing requires other compromises to hit good performance targets. Metro Exodus is a really interesting example when we also include the Enhanced Edition. Basically, when viewing performance using max settings at 1080p, the RTX 2060 is not capable of decently playable performance in any configuration, typically hovering around 30 to 40 FPS. But if we drop the overall preset to medium, ray tracing does become viable even with the visually superior Enhanced Edition. Using medium settings plus lowered RT settings, the Enhanced Edition runs at 86 FPS on average, and while this is a compromised experience compared to high quality modes, it's a better result than we can say for many other titles so far. There's not much to say about ray tracing in Black Myth Wukong. The RTX 2060 is far too slow to run path tracing, making this visually impressive setting off limits even when we compromise other visual settings. Software lumen isn't too much of an issue on the 2060 in this game, at least below the cinematic preset, but also software lumen doesn't require dedicated RT hardware, but yeah, path tracing is a no-go. Alan Wake 2 is one of the best examples of ray tracing, and the RTX 2060 is simply not capable of using it even at 1080p with low settings. This GPU is flat out rendering Alan Wake without ray tracing enabled and can't hit 60 FPS on average even using the low preset. Enabling RT cripples performance and becomes totally unplayable. It's a similar story in Cyberpunk 2077. The modes that are worth using are either Ultra RT or Overdrive, aka path tracing, and the RTX 2060 can't run either of them at acceptable levels of performance. Using the low preset at 1080p with DLSS quality plus ultra ray tracing in the area we tested led to just 21 FPS on average, while the Overdrive mode is completely out of the question. With these visually stunning games, the RTX 2060 falls well short of the ray tracing performance required to enable it. Finally, we get to two titles that use ray tracing across the board with no ability to switch off RT effects. In Star Wars Outlaws, you can forget about playing using ultra settings on the 2060 at 1080p. Not only does the game fail to hit 60 FPS using even the low preset, it also suffers from texture loading issues on high presets, as 6GB of VRAM is insufficient in this title. Meanwhile, in Avatar Frontiers of Pandora, I experienced even worse texture loading problems, and again, the low preset is just not capable of a consistent 60 FPS at 1080p. Now, I guess in both scenarios, you could say that 50 FPS on average using low settings is playable without being a great experience, and I'd probably agree with you, but I was hoping for a bit better performance in these RT-only titles when dialing down the quality settings. If games continue to head down this path and start removing non-RT configurations, cards with this level of RT performance, well, they just won't be able to keep up. When we summarize all of these results into a single chart, we can see how poorly the RTX 2060 has aged for ray tracing. This first chart shows the configurations without visual compromises. I guess, except for running using DLSS quality mode, some people probably will see that as a compromise, but anyway, we're talking ultra or maximum rasterization configurations with ray tracing applied on top. In the 29 game configurations where ray tracing provides a noticeable visual improvement in my opinion, or where ray tracing is always enabled, just 3 of them could be run at 60 FPS on average, and this is at 1080p, not 1440p that the RTX 2060 was initially designed for. Now, I would say that 60 FPS is a reasonable experience in most of these titles, but if we lower the definition of playable down to, say, 40 FPS, we still end up with just 9 configurations delivering a playable experience. In 13 configurations, the average frame rate was below 30 FPS, and in 18 configurations, the 1% low was below 30 FPS. Not a good outcome at all for a GPU that was marketed as being ray tracing capable. Part of this, of course, is that the RTX 2060 is now an entry-level GPU in terms of overall performance. Across the 16 games examined, where you could run them without ray tracing enabled, half of them couldn't achieve 60 FPS using maximum or ultra rasterized settings. So the RTX 2060 was always going to be up against it when ray tracing typically causes a 30 to 40% performance drop. But in just 3 titles, the 2060 failed to deliver a minimum playable 40 FPS average without ray tracing. So it's not all bad if you don't want to use ray tracing. What was disappointing to discover is that across 26 ray tracing configurations, 15 of them couldn't deliver 60 FPS on average, even using the low or lowest possible presets available in the game, again at 1080p with DLSS quality enabled. There are quite a few titles where no matter how far you go to compromise the visual quality in other areas, ray tracing is just not possible. However, in 19 configurations, at least 40 FPS was achievable on average. So if you are willing to compromise the experience and run other settings on low, the RTX 2060 is technically capable of ray tracing in some of these games. But there were really only a handful of titles where I felt ray tracing was truly viable on the RTX 2060 at 1080p in a way that I would consider playing. Guardians of the Galaxy was decent, the Spider-Man games are okay, Metro Exodus Enhanced Edition is playable, and there's a couple of other borderline configurations. I'm not going to try and justify running games at 40 FPS using compromised quality settings to claim the RTX 2060 is actually capable of ray tracing, because I personally would never use that sort of configuration, and I think the vast majority of gamers wouldn't either. You'd most likely turn off ray tracing if the output frame rate was 40 FPS. So what does this tell us? Well, to start with, Nvidia heavily exaggerated the ray tracing capabilities of the RTX 2060 at launch. Now that we have some genuinely great examples of ray tracing, including very impressive path trace modes in titles like Alan Wake 2, we can safely say that the RTX 2060 is not and never was powerful enough to run ray tracing properly. It should never have been a reason to purchase this graphics card and shouldn't have been sold on a promise of a ray tracing future. This was exacerbated by the 2060 including just 6GB of VRAM in its standard configuration, which is crippling enough in some modern titles without even factoring in the VRAM requirements of ray tracing. The simple reality is that as mid-range GPUs age, they quickly become entry-level in the modern landscape and will be up against it when it comes to running games at decent resolutions and quality settings. The RTX 2060 was originally designed as a 1440p 60fps GPU, which made sense at $350 in 2019. In today's titles, you'll be lucky to see 60fps using ultra settings at 1080p with upscaling enabled. Games get more difficult to run over time, not easier, so adding ray tracing on top of that with a card that isn't that fast for normal rasterization, it wasn't going to end well. Now, if we look at the RTX 2060 as a baseline and consider it's a nearly 6-year-old product, I think we should be demanding some very significant advancements in ray tracing with this upcoming GPU generation. 6 years should be enough time to make ray tracing viable in the entry level for 1080p gaming. We're talking 3 GPU generations later, plenty of ray tracing marketing, countless promises and future projections back when hardware accelerated ray tracing was added to GPUs. There's a decent number of ray tracing games now. We should be seeing cards that can actually utilize ray tracing across the entire product stack. I feel that's an acceptable minimum standard to ask for, because how long are we just going to put up with ray tracing being a feature for high-end buyers only? And for mid-range products around that $350 to $450 mark, like the RTX 2060 was at launch, they absolutely should be capable of ray tracing. No excuses and no compromises. People purchase cards in that price range for 1440p gaming, ultra settings, 60 FPS at a minimum. And I don't mean 60 FPS with frame gen, I mean native 60 FPS. Next gen GPUs should be doing that with ray tracing on. I think that's a fair expectation more than 6 years into the ray tracing era. The problem with these expectations is that the baseline needs to rise substantially for it to become a reality. Entry-level GPUs need to be at least double the ray tracing performance of the RTX 2060 to make high-quality 1080p gaming with ray tracing a reality, probably triple the performance or more if we want to factor in path tracing or the most taxing examples. Yet today, the cheapest RTX GPU you can get, the GeForce RTX 3050, is actually quite a bit slower than the RTX 2060. A much higher baseline means developers can integrate more genuinely amazing, high-quality ray tracing effects into games and know that PC gamers have the power to enable those settings. The development effort won't be wasted, more gamers might want to enable ray tracing, and the visual quality of games can move forward at a faster pace, keeping PC gaming at that pinnacle experience level. But that only happens if entry-level and mid-range products get better, and that's something that we will strongly be advocating for on Hardware Unboxed, as we always have. So anyway, that's it for this investigation, a recap, a revisit of the RTX 2060 and what it can do for ray tracing. Hopefully not too many people bought this particular product for its ray tracing back in 2019, because I think you would have been very disappointed with what it provided over the next 6 years, or at least 6 years if you bought it in 2019, that period of time. As I said, we'll be looking closely into ray tracing performance for the upcoming generation of GPUs, which we expect to be launched probably in January of next year. Certainly going to be some very interesting battles there, and as more ray tracing games come to market, more useful ray tracing examples, it's going to become more of a feature that we need to look into for these graphics card generations and reviews. So as I said, all of this examination, all of this testing that we've done on ray tracing up to this point is really to give us a nice picture of what ray tracing is and how we should be testing it for the next generation of GPU reviews. So anyway, thanks for watching. If you're interested in supporting our channel and our independent testing, please consider supporting us via Patreon. Links to that is in the description below. Anyway, that's it. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.